This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a professor of history at Wayne State University in the United States and the author of a new book, Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. It was published last year by Harvard University Press. Dr. Andrew Port, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your book looks at the process of Germany coming to terms with its past, but not so much the retrospective and introspective aspect of it that's been often discussed, and that aspect shaped Germany's post-war collective memory and identity, but rather the practical forward-looking aspect of it. How do Germans, as Germans, react to acts of genocide, whether imminent or ongoing? Can you elaborate on this distinction?
Well, a large part of the book deals with Germany's culture of remembrance. But I was more interested not so much in high-sounding statements and monuments and things like that. I was curious more about how Germans, in very practical terms, responded to genocides in other places. I thought I wanted to take kind of an indirect approach to see how they spoke about genocides, mass atrocities taking place elsewhere, to what extent their memories of their own history played a role in that, in terms of how they interpreted these genocides, their diplomatic and political responses, but I was also interested in how ordinary Germans responded as well. So I look at humanitarian efforts and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So how do you really make the distinction between what either politicians or diplomats or just ordinary people say and what they do? Because part of creating a discourse is really about setting, moral standards and translating that into policy. How do you really define that object of inquiry?
Well, it's a good question. I suppose I read as widely as I could what politicians and diplomats and others had to say, and humanitarian workers and journalists, and tried to, read between the lines. I was very attentive to language, how they spoke about these atrocities, and to what extent. When I first went into the archives and first started reading this material, I half expected to find attempts to somehow relativize Germany's own past by looking at these, terrible things happening in other places. And in the book, I focus on three in particular: Cambodia, Rwanda, and Bosnia. So from the mid-'70s to the mid-'90s. But I was glad in a sense that I didn't find much evidence of that, what I expected. Some historians go into the archives and they have preconceived notions about what they want to find, and I find it more exciting to go in there and realize, oh, you were wrong about that. So what I found was that certainly Germany's role as a perpetrator, it's the country most closely associated with genocide. Right? I found that certainly played a role, especially when it came to Bosnia, in terms of how Germany should respond politically, diplomatically, militarily as well. But what I found very interesting is that it wasn't just about Germany's role as a perpetrator, but also the German self-perception as victims during and after World War II. So during the conflict in Bosnia, when there was discussion of Germany somehow getting involved militarily or participating in these surgical strikes in Serb sections of Bosnia, Germans would talk about their memories of of World War II and the bombing of German cities, and most of them were older at this point. They had been young children, so they reflected on what it had been like. But what I found especially interesting was how much sympathy there was for the plight of refugees, and that had very much to do with Germans' own experience as refugees.
This is interesting because it can be looked at in two very different ways. One is, as you say, it's the common experience that motivated them to act in a more humanitarian way. And the other one is actually it can be looked at what exactly you expected to find but didn't, relativizing. If everyone's a victim, so no one's the perpetrator, so to speak.
Yeah. Again, I suppose I gave Germans very often the benefit of the doubt in a number of cases. What do I mean by that? Well, when they would draw comparisons in terms of imagery or even language between, say, what was happening in Bosnia and what had happened, 50 years earlier in Germany and in Eastern Europe, very often they would use superlative language. So when Bosnia or Cambodia occurred, they would talk about this being the worst atrocity the world had ever seen. Sometimes they'd qualify it since the Holocaust, but that use of superlatives kind of caught my attention. But what I realized at some point was that my suspicion was that they weren't doing it to relativize Germany's own guilt, but by comparing to what had happened in Germany, it was the most effective way in which to convince other people, other Germans, that something had to be done. Right. So it wasn't so much a question of relativization, but what is the worst atrocity you can think of, especially if you're a German or a Jew? You think of the Holocaust. And those examples, those comparisons, that imagery, I think was done not so much to relativize, but more to...
But what about this experience of German suffering, whether as victims of bombings during the war, and also the great population exchanges after the Second World War? I mean, this is really an experience that many Germans carried with them. How did that play into the debate?
Well, interestingly enough, I think that played an important role in terms of German willingness to bring in and accept refugees from these countries. So I think about 14,000 were accepted from Indochina. A good number of those were from Cambodia. And someone like Hans...
In the 70s.
Yeah, that's... the Khmer Rouge is thrown out of power, is removed from power in January 79. The same month, by the way, that the American miniseries Holocaust is shown on West German television.
Interesting.
Which is very interesting because all of a sudden you hear things like Asia's Auschwitz or the Holocaust in Cambodia. Right. So those connections are made, which would have been inconceivable several years earlier. I mean, Helmut Schmidt, he was the first West German chancellor to visit Auschwitz in 1977. And when he gave his speech there, I think it was an impromptu speech, he doesn't even mention the Jews. But he does mention the Germans as the first victims of Hitler, which probably annoyed a lot of Austrians who think they were the first victims of Hitler. But I want to add another example. I was really fascinated by the East German response to these atrocities. So the book starts in the mid-'70s and I take it through the mid-'90s. And one reason I did that was to get a sense of how East Germans would respond to...
You're preempting all my questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
Carry on.
So I was very interested in the East German reaction. My first book had been about East Germany. And what I found there was that the comparison or the historical point of reference was not so much what Germans had done to the Jews. That was never a major topic of discussion. You didn't have the same type of memory culture in East Germany that you had in West Germany. Instead, and this came up a number of times, what East Germans, especially those who were convinced of the correctness of state socialism. They wanted to know how it had been possible for communists to have committed such awful atrocities. And that I found really fascinating. And I also found it honest. I found it genuine. Because, as a Westerner, you think, well, given what Stalin had done, what Mao had done, clearly it shouldn't have been a surprise to them that communists were also capable of committing atrocities. But I found that very interesting. That was the question.
But was it really talked about? I mean, I'm guessing that in the case of Stalin and Mao, it wasn't really talked about. But would you say that the Khmer Rouge massacre received different echo in East Germany?
Yes and no. There was no mention of the Khmer Rouge for the first 3.5 years that they were in power. The East Germans, and I know this from having looked at the archival record, the East Germans tried to have diplomatic relations with the Khmer Rouge, but the Khmer Rouge shut themselves off to almost the entire world except for the Chinese and the North Koreans. So for the first, the Khmer Rouge come to power in April of 1975. Until December of 1978, there's really no mention of the Khmer Rouge in the East German media. Behind the scenes is a different story. The East German diplomatic corps and the politicians had a good sense, just as they did in the West, of what was going on in Cambodia. But there was no contact. But because of the geopolitical constellation, when Vietnam invaded and overthrew the Khmer Rouge, all of a sudden there was great interest in what had happened there because the Khmer Rouge were allies of the Chinese, the Vietnamese of the Soviet Union, and so.
But if while we're on the topic of East Germany or East versus West Germany, it's really interesting because part of that culture of remembrance, whether the more introspective aspect of it or the more practical aspect of it, before 1989 was really defined by the Cold War reality, not just the existence of a very powerful communist bloc, but also the fact that Germany was divided into two states and had a very complicated relationship between them. I'm interested more in the West German case for that. But to what extent do you think that all this, these issues that you discuss in your book, in the 1970s were affected by that reality of West versus East Germany and a broader Cold War setting?
That found expression in a number of ways. For one, the East Germans supplied humanitarian assistance to the new regime in Cambodia directly. The West Germans didn't. They helped their money and supplies and humanitarian aid, also private individuals, flowed into Thailand because so many had left, had fled the Khmer Rouge. And after December 1978, also many Khmer Rouge also went to Thailand to these refugee camps. So the West Germans focused their aid and their efforts there for geopolitical reasons. And the East Germans actually sent aid to Cambodia itself. In fact, I did an interview with the first East German ambassador to Cambodia after the Khmer Rouge were removed from power, which was a really interesting interview. It lasted about 4 hours. He was trained as a truck mechanic and became the ambassador to, which is not I remember he said to me, oh, it's a typical German story. And I quote unquote corrected him and said, I think it's a typical East German story because, most West German diplomats at that time, many of them were still from, old noble families. And so that was one difference where aid flowed. A more interesting case is probably the diplomatic wrangling over who was allowed to represent Cambodia after January 79, when the Khmer Rouge were overthrown. And the East Germans, of course, support the new regime that was installed by the Vietnamese, former Khmer Rouge officers primarily. But the West Germans, along with the United States and China, and by the way, the other West European countries as well, through their support behind the Khmer Rouge and Prince Sihanouk, who had been the king of Cambodia since the 40s. And that was very interesting to me, that the Khmer, also that the United States, and this is the time when Jimmy Carter is talking, about human rights. Some people think thanks to him in 1977, human rights becomes a major issue in international relations for a variety of reasons, mainly Cold War reasons. They throw their weight behind the Khmer Rouge, as crazy as that sounds.
But I'm also interested in like the more domestic German arena, because both West and East Germany, each in their own terms, represented that calling of never again, but in a very different way.
Yes.
And they both claimed some sort of like first dibs on it, if you will. How the resistance or the antithesis to Nazism and fascism and genocide was translated into politics on a day-to-day level. And how did these different discourses were translated into the humanitarian discourse and anything that had to do with genocide prevention, etc.?
Well, again, I'll start with the East German case. It did not play a great role, despite what some pundits and public intellectuals, and I won't mention names, but despite what some have argued recently, that the East Germans did a better job of dealing with the Holocaust than the West Germans did, it's just simply not true. There's a lot of confusion between dealing with the Nazi past and dealing with the Holocaust. And they're not one and the same thing. In East Germany, it's not that the genocide of the Jews, that the Holocaust, they wouldn't have used that term, Holocaust, but it wasn't that it was denied. It's just Jews did not have the same place in terms of the hierarchy of victimhood that they did in the West. In West Germany, it was communists and workers who were the main victims of National Socialism. The exceptions to that were, a series of, I can name two in particular. One was a series of articles that appeared in Neues Deutschland, which was the official organ of the Communist Party, written by a fellow named Gerhard Leo, who was an East German, a German Jew, came from a communist family, had been, Neues Deutschland sent him, I believe, to Paris in 1968 to cover the events there. So he spoke French, so he was also sent to Cambodia. He was one of the first journalists to go in, and he drew very direct parallels, invoking Eichmann, talking about, he did interviews with Khmer Rouge perpetrators who said they were just following orders. And he would say in his articles things like, where have we heard that before? So for him, given his background as a Jew, as a communist, he had a bit of a different take. But I also watched a series of documentary films that were made by the two best-known East German documentarians, Walter Heinowski and Gerhard Scheumann, and they went to Cambodia in late 79, early 80, and they made a series of 3 films. And there, the comparison, also visually in terms of what you see in these films, the comparison couldn't be more direct between Hitler and, what Hitler had done to the Jews and what had happened to the Khmer Rouge. In fact, I did an interview with Heinowski in Berlin. He didn't want to meet with me, but he finally did. And apparently we hit it off because we sat for 4 or 5 hours chatting. And And he told me that ever since he was a young man and had seen Jews who had survived the war, had survived the Holocaust, that theme had dominated his life. And that, again, is quite clear in these documentaries. So again, I found that interesting. Before I was being a bit arch when I said that there were some people out there who are now claiming that East Germans dealt with the genocide of the Jews in a more substantive way or a more comprehensive way than the West Germans, which is nonsense. But the opposite claim that the Holocaust was not a theme in East Germany is also nonsense. And I'll give another example. The East Germans were helping the Vietnamese prepare a trial in absentia of Pol Pot and Ieng Sary, the other main leader. And the Vietnamese side made claims that I'm trying to think of the exact language, but that the Khmer Rouge were worse than the Nazis, and what they did. And the East German fellow, the diplomat, vigorously contradicted that and spoke about the use of Cyclone B. Now, it's quite clear what he was referring to. So again, people like to make extreme claims, right? The East Germans didn't talk about the Holocaust at all, or now lately we hear the East Germans did it better than the West Germans. It's just not.
And in West Germany, it's really interesting because the discussion around Khmer Rouge in the 70s in general came in the wake of this awakening of the late 1960s, where all sorts of issues. The Nazi past was talked about in a different way that it had been before. Can you really talk about this evolution and how it played into the debate in the 1970s around that issue?
Right. So I think that it's a misconception that the West Germans kind of discover the Holocaust in the late 1960s. That wasn't a major theme on the part of the 68ers, the student revolt movement. I remember the first time I heard that claim, Raoul Hilberg, the great historian of the Holocaust, gave a talk in Weimar that I attended decades ago, and he said that, and I had never, that was news to me. But it turns out it's true. There were references to the Holocaust, not using that term, it was called Auschwitz at the time, or the final solution. But it was used to convey a sense of German victimhood. So the RAF, the Red Army faction, they referred to themselves as the New Jews. When they were put in prison, they were being subject to a Sonderbehandlung, So it really wasn't the case that in the late 60s, young Germans started to talk about the Holocaust. That happens a decade later, right? But again, in all fairness, it's also wrong to claim that the 68 generation discovered the crimes of the Nazis. There is a prehistory to that in West Germany itself, already beginning in the late 50s. There's a series of terrible anti-Semitic acts in Cologne and elsewhere in 1959, winter 59-60. This is around the time, 58-59, that the first trial takes place of SS officers, the Ulm trial. Ludwigsburg, which is charged with investigating Nazi crimes and going after perpetrators, is set up. And then you have, of course, Eichmann in 61, 62, that trial, and then the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial. So there is a prehistory to these young people. Well, they're not so young anymore, but these young people talking about the Nazi past. But so again, I guess the point I'm trying to make is, one, their focus was not on the Holocaust. That really begins after the miniseries, when the miniseries Holocaust is shown in January 79. It's clearly not the first time Germans or West Germans hear about this awful event, but it becomes emotionally charged in a way that it hadn't been before. It's really when, in a sense, I write in the book something like, this is when the Holocaust, small h, became the Holocaust, capital H, when that really became a focal point of German identity and self-reflection.
So would you say that the way they reacted to Rwanda and Bosnia in the early 1990s was actually a more direct result of that renewed Holocaust debate than Cambodia in the 1970s?
Certainly with Bosnia, the comparisons are much clearer, because after the 80s, after a decade of so much attention being paid to the Holocaust, in Bosnia, the connections are drawn almost immediately. In Rwanda, less so, but don't forget, Rwanda was so quick in a sense. It lasted only 3 months. Had it lasted longer, the reaction might have been different. But Cambodia, I think the fact that the miniseries, again, as I mentioned before, is shown. The miniseries is shown on West German television for the first time the same month that the Khmer Rouge is ousted from power. And all of a sudden you have these revelations about what the Khmer Rouge had done, and the comparisons begin immediately. They were there before. But it really takes off after that, but not enough for Helmut Schmidt to have said, maybe it's not a good idea to vote in favor of the Khmer Rouge and their allies at the UN. I did an interview with Helmut Schmidt years ago in Hamburg, and I asked him about that. And, he kind of feigned ignorance that he didn't remember it of course. But he told me that he had enough difficulties with Jimmy Carter as it was, so he didn't want to, make things even more tense. Can I tell you a brief anecdote about Helmut Schmidt?
Of course.
I have several I could tell you about, but one is one of my professors as an undergraduate, Henry Turner, had him as a guest at his house, and Schmidt had been at one of the trials of the July 20th conspirators. And Turner, who was an expert on the Nazi period, wanted to find out, asked him what it was like. And he told Turner that ever since he had gotten a pacemaker, his memory had become very.
It's probably a very nice metaphor to the remembrance of the Holocaust and a culture of remembrance of the Holocaust in Germany. So Bosnia and Rwanda, you said that Bosnia, there was a very clear comparison drawn. It probably had to do with the fact also that it was on European soil, unlike Cambodia and Rwanda, that they were like the so-called brown people, as opposed to, not Central and Western Europeans, but it was much closer to home than before, and also part of that regional sphere that the Nazis sought to occupy and did to a certain extent.
Yeah, not just that. Also, many Germans after the war had close relations with Yugoslavia because so many guest workers came from Yugoslavia starting in the late 50s and 60s. Many Germans, including West Germans, went on vacation in the Balkans. So there was a connection that there wasn't to Cambodia or Rwanda. Of course, one state, I forget which one, but one of the German states had a whole series of sister city partnerships in Rwanda, and those people were more involved. But Bosnia really was a different story. And for the reason you say, it was closer to home. It was, quote unquote, culturally closer to Germany. There was Germany's own history there during the
So that motivated German decision makers and whatever organizations to act differently?
Yes and no. What I found extremely interesting was that there was a major debate in the 90s about how involved Germany should get in terms of the response to what the Bosnian Serbs were doing.
Militarily?
Militarily. Yeah, in terms of humanitarian aid and bringing in refugees, that was also an asylum seekers. That was also an issue. But there was a real debate about whether or not the Germans should get involved militarily, and both sides, people on both sides of the issue, used German history to make the argument that Germany should get involved or shouldn't get involved. So the ones who thought that Germany had a responsibility, a duty to, they pointed to Holocaust and say, we talk about never again, and we just can't stand by and not do anything. And then on the other extreme, you had politicians, mainly on the left, but not just, who argued, never again war should go out from German soil, and so there were better ways to deal with it: humanitarian aid, diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, but not military aid. Which I always, as a historian, I try to remain as neutral as maybe to a fault, but I try to, I want to know how people, the historical actors, how they thought, what motivated them, and I try not so much to pass judgment. But I found it rather disingenuous on the part of those who argued against German military involvement, saying that Germany should never wage war again. It's one thing to send in occupation troops to a country. It's a different animal altogether, trying to help save innocent people who are, being slaughtered.
And that's a beautiful segue into the current situation and the German response to Israel in general and the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and to the current war in Gaza that brings up many similarities, but also many differences. And first of all, did you work on this book change any of your perceptions about the special relationship of Germany with Israel, this never again with respect to the Jews, to the state of Israel, and by implication, the treatment of the Palestinians by Israel?
There are a lot of academics and pundits and public intellectuals in the United States now who claim, and not just in the United States, in the UK as well, who claim that for the Germans, Israel is sacrosanct and that they have unconditional support. I have to say, I think that's a parody of the German position. I mean, if you look at recent criticisms by German foreign minister of Israeli policy, saying you have to, hold back, it's quite clear that Germany does not support Israeli policy, regardless of what the Israelis do. What I will say is that my own experiences in Germany, maybe it was the milieu that I hung out in, but ever since my first trip was to Germany, to West Berlin in the winter of 1987, and I remember being on the subway there and being asked by somebody, well, what do you think about what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians? And this is in the wake of Lebanon, so I have never found the Germans to be particularly careful about criticizing Israel. In fact, I remember in the summer of 1993, I was dancing with a German woman in Berkeley, California, who started, she really got into a rage, saying, what right do the Israelis have to make us feel bad about what we did, given what they're doing to the Palestinians today? And I can give you...
Again, it's a question of German victimhood again. It's through the back door in a way. I mean, again, it's shifting the focus back to them.
Yeah, I think you could... Yeah, victimhood, or this feeling of guilt or shame about their country's past. I mean, to me, it's interesting. Why all of a sudden in the 60s do you have young Germans on the left who become critical of the United States and Vietnam? What I'm about to say now is not to call into question not the U.S. and Vietnam or Israel during the Six-Day War. I'm not calling into question the correctness or the validity of their arguments and their criticisms, but I've long had the impression that there must have been something comforting to be able to point to the two countries that make you feel most guilty or ashamed, the U.S. and Israel, and say, look, they're committing atrocities comparable to what the Germans. There must have been something liberating about that. Is it German victimhood? Maybe. But I understand that psychological dynamic. I think it's, still going on too.
But would you say that the same sort of psychological dynamics that drove the debates around Cambodia and Bosnia and Rwanda are the ones that drive the debate around Israel and Palestine in Germany? Or is it a totally different magnitude?
I think it's quite different. When it comes to Israel, I don't think you can compare their feelings about the Khmer Rouge or Bosnia to how Germans,
No, but about refugees and about people suffering and about bombings of civilians. I mean, the issues are essentially the same issues. It's just the context that is different.
Yes, that's correct. But then you would expect greater criticism today of what Israel is doing in Gaza. And of course, there are many protests against that. And there are claims that nobody is allowed to criticize Israeli policy in Germany and that there are these, almost Gestapo-like crackdowns. It's a complete distortion of what the situation is.
But these claims are being made in the US as well.
The US and the UK, yeah. And also by some Germans as well who, again, are on the extreme left. And it's not to say that their criticisms are wrong. They're just distorted and exaggerated. And I write about this in a recent piece that I wrote about Germany, Gaza, and genocide. They're people who had long admired the Germans for their culture of remembrance about the Holocaust. In the last 3 or 4 years, these same people are now condemning the Germans because the claim is that they are so focused on what Germany had done to the Jews that they're blind to what Israelis are doing today. And there are a number of reasons that are cited for why this change has occurred. What is left out of the equation is the real uptick in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incidents in Germany in the last couple of years, which is in part tied to the new wave of immigration. That's not to say that all the Syrians who have come to Israel are anti-Semitic, but again, this is impressionistic. I don't live in Germany, but I visit, and what I hear that the being a Jew, visibly being a Jew in Germany, is kind of a fraught.
Well, the question of Germany's relationship with Jews is no longer a predominantly historical question. It's a very burning topical question. It's become that.
Yeah, and no, it certainly has. I mean, I will say this, as a Jew myself, as an American Jew myself, I have never in Germany experienced overt anti-Semitism. In fact, it's been more of a bonus. I remember an ex-girlfriend of mine, I took her to New York once, and she was so disappointed. She said, you're on every corner here. There's nothing special about you. So there's that, that sympathy of that has been brought about because of Germany's own crimes in the past. But it's I find it incredibly difficult to make broad generalizations, and I know that's what people are expected to do. They want easy answers. The Germans are all still anti-Semites, or they're all philo-Semites, or whatever. It's more complicated and complex. Yeah, I know. People don't like to hear that it's complicated, But it is complicated.
That's why you're getting the big bucks as a historians, right? I want to ask you one last question, perhaps, Andrew.
Sure.
When it comes to Never Again, that calling, it's quite often said that among the Jews, it's interpreted in two very different, perhaps mutually exclusive ways. One is to say never again to us, and the other is never again universally, like a more particularistic message as opposed to a universalistic one. Would you say that in Germany it goes along the same fault line, more or less?
Again, I think it depends on who one speaks with. Certainly, historically, when one thinks, I think for most Germans, when they hear the phrase "never again," it is clearly connected to the 1940s and the Holocaust. But it also is more universal, the sense that we cannot stand by again when innocent people are, because of their ethnicity or religion or what have you, are massacred.
Mm-hmm. All right. Professor Andrew Porter, historian at Wayne State University and the author of the rather newly published Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has close to 1,000, or perhaps even more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.